Record. There we go.
All right. Hi everybody. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Well, I guess it's not Boker anymore, but I hope everybody's doing well. How's everybody's Sukkot so far?
I haven't made
Good.
it into a sukkah yet, but
Well, all in good time, so to speak. Nice. So before we get down to business, two things. One being if anybody would like to dedicate their learning today to anyone, just want to give people the opportunity to do that. Then we'll say the blessing for Torah study. And you can dedicate it to yourself. You are valuable too. So if you'd like to dedicate it to yourself, do it.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
I dedicate it to, and I'll dedicate it to my grandfather Arnold, who he only had a sixth grade education, but he spent his last years studying Spinoza in a group, the Spinoza Forum in Miami.
Very cool.
And it
To
wasn't
Arnold.
a art site too.
Oh yeah, that's thank you.
Don't ask me how I remember all these, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I remember people's birthdays from third grade that I wasn't even friends with.
Love that. Amazing. Well, to Arnold, to those who are enjoying the holiday, to those who are in need of some help this holiday season, we'll say the blessing for Torah studies together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushenu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu
Yes.
la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Oh yeah.
Um, get soaked in Torah and how appropriate for this week's learning. So I said at the beginning, I'll say it again for the video, for posterity, for whomever. This is a weird topic. I frankly, there's a lot of different ways that I could go with it, and so I wasn't really sure. The ordering could be improved upon for the text sources that I used. Um, but I got really sort of hooked into an idea with a lot of sources and not necessarily a specific end point necessarily, but just more a bunch of things to sort of keep together and continue to think about. In the education world, we call them enduring questions. So things that don't necessarily have answers, but that we keep coming back to and sort of meditating on and coming with different answers depending on where we are in life. Um, and so because we are in Sukkot, uh, I wanted to, and like for some reason, I've been in all these spaces and nobody's reading Kohelet, nobody's reading Ecclesiastes, which I'm like, now is the pun intended, not intended, I guess, but there is a time for this, and this is the time for it. So, for those who uh, maybe are unfamiliar with Kohelet, so Kohelet is the Hebrew name for Ecclesiastes. Um, and Kohelet is actually a like the narrator in Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew, which kind of gets lost in the English translation. And there's been a lot of discussion about like who Kohelet is. Is Kohelet like uh, a wizened King David or like a Solomon right? Like, is it a king? Is it somebody who is part of the royal family, but not necessarily a sovereign? Like, who is this person? Um, and it sort of gives a little bit of a taste, some similarities to like Proverbs, to Mishlei, which is hi Wilma, which in Mishlei you get a lot of like common proverbs that we know. But the thing that people usually think about when they think about Kohelet is a little bit of cynicism. They often think of, I jokingly have said that Kohelet is like the emo book of the of Tanakh, in the sense that like, he's like, well, whatever, like it's cool, drink up, because like You never know, right? There's a little bit of a fatalism or um I'm trying to think of the word. There's a not fatalism, there's a uh maybe nihilism to some extent, uh to his words. And so I think that that often is like, it's sort of like when you read Jack Kerouac when you're in high school, or Catcher in the Rye when you're in high school, and you're like, wow, what an incredible book. And then you look back and you're like, well, Holden Caulfield, yikes. So maybe that's how we come to Kohelet. But what I think is really interesting, is I've gotten to spend some time with Kohelet in different ways. And one of the ways that we can go into it is if we think of Kohelet as actually part of what's called Stoic philosophy. So the Stoics were a group, a, a, a school of philosophy in Greece. And we usually think of stoic as like as an adjective for like being stone faced, right? Like you're being stoic. Um, but the Stoics were very interesting in that they were actually more focused on the best way to live one's life was to be in the moment, right? To align yourself with what was ever happening sort of in the zeitgeist was the way to best be in the moment. So if you like keep going against the crowd, or if you don't get into that pattern, you actually set yourself up to feel disenfranchised, or you set yourself up to be sort of disconnected from what's happening. So the Stoics are very interesting and I think usually very misunderstood. So if we think of Kohelet as sort of a Hebrew Stoic, that's very interesting. A different interpretation, uh, although I mean, I suppose this is also related to the Stoicism piece, is that Kohelet is actually talking about the experience of sort of the rise of empire. So Kohelet is writing at a time where we're seeing like the rise of Egyptian and the Ptolemaic Empire. And so what happens during the Ptolemaic Empire and a lot of things, but we see a change in the way we do business. We see huge machines of people, right? Like a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of levels of bureaucracy, to the point of you're no longer a person, right? Like you really are sort of just a cog in this wheel of empire. And so, in that sense, what's really fascinating is to think of Kohelet sort of as a critique of that and a call to like be a human in a time devoid of humanness, which feels very appropriate at the moment, in many ways. And so I really love Kohelet and I really appreciate it. But what I actually wanted to talk about is there is one of the questions that comes up in Kohelet is time. Um, and so I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you all, talking about this concept in Kohelet and thinking about sort of what comes up when we think about in a religious tradition what Sukkot is supposed to mean versus sort of the layers of how time and themes of time come up in terms of our liturgy. So I am going to, do I have the ability to share this? I do. Okay, cool. So I want to start with this is the thing that probably most people are familiar with. So I'm gonna get rid of that. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Wave avoid. Okay. So I want to start. So this is Kohelet 1 through 11. And this is something that probably you are very familiar with. When people pull stuff from Ecclesiastes, this is the thing that they usually pull. It's a great song to every season, turn, turn, turn. But I want to read through it because I think it's really beautiful. And we often miss the last piece, verse 11. We often miss that piece. So I mean, there's a couple of us, you don't all have to, but I would love for me to not be the one who reads all of it. So if somebody wants to start us off and we can go round robin or take two at a time.
Sounds good. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted.
A time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down, and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing.
A time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace.
What value then can the man of affairs get from what he earns? I have observed the business that God gave man to be concerned with. He brings everything to pass precisely at its time. He also puts eternity in their mind, but without man ever guessing, from first to last, all the things that God brings to pass.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Liz, go for it. You were going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I hadn't noticed that verse before.
Yeah, we get this really. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second because I actually want us to think about impressions rather than reading through, right? This isn't a lit class. I'm not expecting you to back up what you're saying. I wanted to get your impression. If you want that, I highly suggest you go to book club. Parable of the Sower, very good. Anyway, the yeah, usually we get the list. Usually we get there's a time for this, there's a time for this, there's a time for this, there's a time for this. So what are some things that stick out like in terms of how does that sort of theology hit you on one foot? Like just like you hear this and you're like, does that ring for you? Does that feel not true? Like what how does it come to you? Or how do you come to it, I suppose?
Now, the way things have been being presented to me lately with like all of a sudden people dying who shouldn't be dying and just things seem like out of kilter. It's like there's no definite why, or it should be like this. And I think that what really hits me is we can't always plan what time there is for what. It's really not our choice. It just kind of, unfortunately, sometimes just happens. Some things we can plan, but most things we can't plan.
Yeah, thank you.
I've been thinking about, because I only remembered the there's a time for war and a time for peace, or vice versa. And I've been thinking about Ecclesiastes and the birds and Jim McGuinn and Roger McGuinn, whoever. And while I would dream and hope and be strangely optimistic that someday we won't have war, I think about that unanswered question. Like sometimes there is a reason for war, but I'm very amorphous about it.
Thank you.
It seems like it's all connected, and that last verse is saying it's all God, because it's creation. It's all, my brain was also going to like, it's all valid, and it's all, my brain even goes to like your reactions are valid, and how you interact in all of this is still God, still connected, still valid, kind of.
Thank you.
Wilma.
Now it just makes me think of pandemics. If you look at pandemics, they happen every 100 years. And it's almost like we can't stop it. It's just kind of a cycle that if you look back, we look back at it with every 100 years, we had the flu, then we had plagues. Every 100 years, we have some kind of disaster that wipes out large amounts of people. We can react to them, but we can't plan it.
I love that you brought that up because in the first chapter of Kohelet, right? Havel, right? It's this idea of vanity of vanities or wind of wind, or it gets translated in a lot of different ways. But this idea of one of the things that you might know that Kohelet says is there's nothing new under the sun, right? Everything's already happened. What changes is us, right? People come and people go who have forgotten what's already happened and they think that it's new and they don't know how to respond to it. So even though we can look back, right, and we can argue, right, especially today, that so stepping back for just 1 second, right? History as a business, I'll just call it that for right now. I don't actually mean business, but like history as a discipline. There we go.
Okay.
History as a discipline is quite new. It's really only in the 18th century that we begin to really think about, well, what is history? Like, how do we write history? Because you have to remember, we also in the 17th, 16th, 17th century, we're seeing a transition from, oh, so the Bible might actually not be history really, at least not how we mean it, how we mean it today. And so really the idea of history as a discipline where we write books and we analyze, like you were saying, Wilma, right? Like every 100 years, like we see this pattern, right? Um, and if you just assume that like God did it, then you don't really necessarily you're not necessarily as worried about the historical patterning because you're like, well, God did it, so what does it matter if it's historical, right? Like we just need to do something, right? Like we need to be better people, right? Like it's a call to be a better person or whatever. So it's a very interesting, that's very interesting. So you're all bringing up, right, that such a weird piece of this time idea. I'm thinking about I'm sorry, Betsy, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, did I do
Oh,
something?
you're fine. I thought maybe it was
No,
just
I'm
a
just
sound.
listening.
Okay. It was just the sometimes the thing lights up, so I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't
Um,
cutting you off. Um, the some of the things that I also think about is we get this list, right? Which is all very it's this or it's that. Um, but right, one piece of that is that it might actually be the same time for two different things at the same time, right? Being born and building up might actually be happening at the same time. So what do we actually, right? Like doing one thing at a time doesn't make any sense. And that also implies this idea of it's very difficult for us to hold the idea that it could actually be two things. It could be two different interpretations of the same thing, right? So this idea of, I'm not gonna name anything specific because that's sort of the point, but like when we think of social movements, often people who agitate for social movements, even though they are tearing something down, right, believe they are building something up. They don't necessarily see it as war, they see it as something other than right. So they might see themselves outside of this war peace dynamic, because we might have a very particular interpretation. So this idea of what time, when, and the last verse really brings it home for us, like you were saying, Wilma, right? We don't know. We actually, at the end of the day, we don't know. But what Kohelet says, and I love sort of the like, well, to be human, right? I've observed the business that God gave man to be concerned with, right? Sick people, sorry, this JPS translation, God brings everything to pass precisely at its time, but also puts eternity in their minds.
Wow.
So it's not just that, on the one hand, right, we might have a sense of the security, this like circular notion of sort of moving through time. And there's these moments where things happen, but people, even if you can accept that, even if you can accept what Wilma said, that this happens every X number of years, we know that it does, even if you can accept that, it still doesn't take away our instinct to want to imagine eternity. It doesn't take away our desire to know, even though we can't actually know. And that's the human condition, right? The human condition is to understand that we don't have control and yet constantly be trying to put controls on what we can.
But we can
Go ahead, Lima.
look
Yeah.
at what mistakes we've made, not to make them again.
Looking backwards automatically contains that, well, what are we going to learn from this and how do we move forward? So it's that idea of eternity goes in both directions.
Yeah. I'm not, and I want to be very clear today. I'm going to be that annoying person. I promise. I hope it's not too annoying, but I'm going to be that annoying person who doesn't say yes or no to anything because I think that's sort of where Kohelet puts us. And so I'm hearing what both of you are saying, and I'm like, yeah, absolutely. They can fine tune our ability to predict, but Mark Twain has you've probably heard this phrase before, right? Mark Twain says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And I always love this idea, right? Like we can predict better, we can do slightly better to not make the same mistake. But if we think that we make a mistake and right, there's really two ways you can go. You can overcorrect, right? You can pendulum swing and fail in a different way, totally possible. Or you make very small, gradual change. But rarely have I experienced, and I will only speak for myself, rarely have I experienced that I correct a mistake and do it correctly. Usually, I correct something, and in so doing, I actually put something else out of alignment.
Oh, yeah. I hear you, brother.
You know, yeah, it is what it is. So I think that that's right. I think what you're saying is right, that we should, we can look at our past. And that's actually not a guarantee that we're not going to make, if not the same, then a very similar mistake to what we did the first time around. Um, and maybe we just get used to that and that's what keeps us sane. I don't know. Um, and so the reason I wanted to talk about this topic this week is because I got hooked on this idea of the things that happen in a moment versus eternity constantly being there. And so often when we talk about the Sukkah, when we talk about Sukkot, you'll hear rabbis or teachers talk about, oh, Sukkot is about the how everything's temporary, everything is constantly in flux. And we sort of have to, nothing is forever, right? Is what we're supposed to be taking away in some instance. And I happened across this article by a guy from the Hadar Institute, which I'm happy to send out that as well. But it's a practice that I've never seen. I think that it's probably Hadar is like an Orthodox, modern Orthodox. So maybe this is an Orthodox, maybe you've experienced this, but he brought this very interesting blessing that many people do at the end of Sukkot. So in Hebrew, Yehi ratzon yafanecha Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu kashem shekimti v'shavti b'sukkazu ken eske l'shana haba v'yashem b'sukkah shel Leviathan. So may it be the will of God and Lord of our ancestors, just as I have fulfilled a mitzvah by sitting in my sukkah. May I merit, this is the Ken SK, may I merit next year and a sukkah made out of the skin of Leviathan.
What does that mean?
I'm gonna pause there because what does Leviathan mean?
Isn't it,
Great. I'm so glad you asked. Go, Liz, go for it.
wasn't it also used for whale?
Ah, okay, beautiful. So this is the okay. Beautiful. You're setting me up. I just promise I didn't pay either of you, but I really appreciate it. So the Leviathan is actually the name of the whale in Pinocchio, I'm pretty sure. But
There was a whale
Le-
in Pinocchio.
yeah, the children get swallowed up by the whale.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. Leviathan. So Leviathan is also Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan, which uses this idea of a whale. So this is why I said, what is the connection to Jonah? Now I want to be really honest with you. It was a trick question. There's no connection to Jonah. If we're looking at the story of Jonah, I'm going to, sorry, I have to scroll a little bit to get there. Maybe. Did I put it in here? Oh no.
I think up
I
one.
thought,
No, down.
oh no. Baba Batra, Ruth. Oh no. Okay. So it's okay.
I can find, tell me about
The
it, I'll find it.
oh I can it's I can look it up. It's Jonah 2:1. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. So this is a weird thing. This is very similar to when people talk about Adam and Eve and the apple, and you're like, what apple? Like, there's no apple in Genesis, right? It's a weird thing that comes out of Christian iconography, right? Christians at some point made it an apple because, does anybody know this? This is actually very interesting.
hmm.
The the Latin root for the word apple is malice,
Wow.
which is related to the word mal, which is bad. So
Oh,
what did they eat? They did the bad thing, so they must have eaten an apple. It's
Apple.
actually it's a very cool midrash. It's like sort of a cool Christian midrash on this thing. Many rabbis think it's like a pomegranate. Like there's this whole thing. So, um, but so this Leviathan whale thing is a very weird thing that happens again because of Christian iconography. In some ways, Christian iconography. So if we're looking in just give me 1 second
Want
while I
to?
get to Jonah.
Oh, I got it.
Oh, you got it? Okay, amazing. So Vayamin Adonai Dag Gadol leave Loa et Yona. So here we have the JPS is very helpful here because JPS is getting very close, right? It says Dag Gadol, a big fish. That's all we got is a big fish. Um, what is interesting, and I'll just point this out, this is just a fun factoid. At this point, it's Dag Gadol. Later on, it's referred to as Daga Gadolah. So it goes from masculine to feminine. So the rabbis say what actually happened is a Dag Gadol, a male fish, swallowed Jonah, and Jonah was being stubborn. And so what actually then ended up happening is that another fish either came and swallowed Jonah, like a tighter fish, or that fish swallowed the other fish. So there might have been two fish. It's a very funny thing. But we very clearly have Dag Gadol in this particular place. So that's fine. That's cool. So the question becomes, so the Christian tradition said, oh, big fish, it could be whale. So we're gonna just, the Leviathan must be related to this whale idea.
hmm.
There's lots of reasons that have to do with constant retranslation of the text as to why got to where it is. But Leviathan is actually does show up, um, sort of shows up earlier and shows up because we often go past this part because we're so concerned with like the bunnies and the rabbits and or like the bunnies and the turtles and stuff like that. But in Genesis 1:21, Ve'yivra Elohim et hataninim hagedolim. God created the great sea monsters. Usually we go right directly to the creeping things and the swarms. But the first thing is that it actually says God created sea monsters. And so Leviathan is in Jewish tradition is one of those sea monsters. Uh there's different midrashim, there's different rabbinic explanations as to like what's happening here. Is it like first it said that God made a female and a male Leviathan, just like God made everything else in, in reproducing pairs. Uh, but because they would take over the world, God killed the female Leviathan. Um, it's just so weird. So I want to show you a picture. These are from medieval manuscripts. They're quite cool. This is uh different, just like different interpretations of the Leviathan. So this is one interpretation of the Leviathan, quite fun. And the Leviathan is not actually, it's not specifically Jewish. Leviathan, this comes from I actually think it comes from a Christian manuscript. But the Leviathan here, or the idea of the Leviathan comes from Lotan, which was an Amoraic, or Amoritic, excuse me, idea. So there was this god named Yamu, who was the god of the sea, and Lotan was one of the monsters that served. It's this weird translation into the Hebrew Bible that we get as a sea monster. This is a different interpretation. For some people, it looked very much like a dragon. It didn't actually look like a fish at all. It actually looked like a dragon, and it breathes fire and has scales that like are impossible to pierce, but swims underwater. And then this is another manuscript, but you can see right here, there's these little like worm things. So in the lore of the Leviathan, this is called a kilbit. Uh, and the kilbit is like a little worm that attaches to the gills of the Leviathan and kills it. So it's the only thing the Leviathan is afraid of. I just wanted to put it out there. This is just like a weird. So this is this Leviathan. So usually we think of Jonah as being swallowed by a whale, or like people think of Jonah being swallowed by a whale. Whale gets turned into Leviathan, but Leviathan is totally its own thing. That has very little to do with Jonah. However, going back to Wilma's question, what is this doing? What is Leviathan doing in a prayer about a sukkah? Like, why are we talking about this weird sea monster in the sukkah? And so the what's happening is a very weird piece of Talmudic lore. So I'm going to share this again. I know I'm sharing a lot of things, but this is, like I said, there's a lot of, it's sort of a very strange and circuitous route to get to it. So this comes from Bava Batra, which is, does a lot of things. Usually it's about damages, but as we probably have experienced before, Talmud just likes to sort of go where it goes. It doesn't really worry about whether or not it makes a lot of sense. So Rabbah says that Rabbi Yochanan says, in the future, the Holy One, blessed be he, will prepare a sukkah for the righteous from the skin of the Leviathan. As it is stated, can you fill his skin with barbed irons, Bisukot? If one is deserving of being called righteous, an entire sukkah is prepared for him from the skin of the Leviathan. If one is not deserving of this honoring, a covering is prepared for his head, as it is stated, or his head with fish spears. So, this is a very weird passage, but what this gets translated as, or what this gets morphed into, is that the rabbis believed, or at least some of them, that at the end times, when the Moshiach came, what would happen is the male Leviathan and the female Leviathan, right? The female Leviathan is already slaughtered, but the male Leviathan would be slaughtered and skinned, and that skin would be turned into a sukkah, and the meat of the Leviathan would be served to the righteous. It's so weird. It's so odd. And not only because, like, can we eat a dragon? Like, isn't a dragon a reptile? It's like a whole weird thing. Does it have fins and scales or just scales? So is it actually kosher? I don't know. But what comes up for me is that we're ending a holiday that is about being temporary, even as we're making a blessing and talking about a perpetual future with the Messiah. Right? So this is sort of the unsatisfying, but this is like one of the answers to this question of, well, so we can kind of accept that we're never going to know, and we can't get the idea of eternity out of our heads, right? So the Sukkah and Sukkot and this moment become a really interesting juxtaposition of those things, right? We're in a holiday that is about being temporary, that is about instability, which might be our acceptance of like we can't control, even as we're making this blessing that's about finding the savior, right? The Messiah coming back, and us eating a banquet in the skin of this Leviathan. It's so weird. I don't like how is that, where does that sit for people? What comes up for you as I'm saying this? Oh, I see a chat. Hold on, sorry.
Is it basically like we're supposed to, by putting eternity in our minds, this future desire for permanence, or like we can tolerate the instability now because there will be something more solid, and so there, this is the time for this and there will be that time for that later.
I want to be clear. I don't think there's any wrong answers here. I'm fascinated by it because I think that, with maybe the exception of like hardcore Orthodox, I don't know how many people are still like believe quite so literally in a Messiah in that way. Um, and so I'm like wondering, sorry, I just have to plug in my computer. And so I'm like left wondering what we're to do with this piece of information. Right? Like, is there a way for us to sort of, we talk about reconstructing all the time. Is there a way to reconstruct this? Is there a way to make this meaningful? Do we only accept one half, the half where we don't know? And like, we just have to be okay with that? I don't know. Um,
How do you reconstruct a sea monster? Yeah.
like I love it, but it doesn't, it's like as a metaphor, it's very interesting. There is I'm forgetting the scholar's name, but it was in an article that was talking about it is a metaphor, it's an allegory about like at the end, the sort of like the serpent, this like weird Leviathan thing represents chaos, and the ending of it is the separating it up into digestible bits, right? Splitting the chaos up into digestible bits, which I always think, I'm like, that's cool.
So someday we will control even chaos and have mastered it enough to make a sukkah out of its skin.
I I suppose, right? Or like maybe it's one of those things where it's like you just really become okay with like you really just become okay with the not knowing, which in some way, which isn't that weird, which would be probably pretty close to some interpretations of Buddhist thought, right? The disassociation from control allows you to be more present in whatever the moment is because you can't control it. So maybe that's what it is. And I wish that I could say that like, oh, it's just Sukkot, but we know that it's not just Sukkot where this happens. So we think of this. So Shavuot, we read Ruth, and the very, very end of Ruth. So Ruth marries Boaz, right? The guy from the threshing floor, and has a baby. And her mother-in-law, Naomi, or whatever, however we want to describe Naomi, but like her mother-in-law, basically. We get this exchange between the women of Bethlehem and Naomi about blessed be the Lord who has not withheld a redeemer from you today. So redeemer in this case is it's like a weird, may his name be perpetuated in Israel. So we have two things happening. One is Boaz, the redeemer, and we also have the perpetuation of a name, which is the whole reason why, or one of the reasons I should say, that Ruth has to get married to carry on her husband's name because he didn't have any kids himself. So he will renew your life and sustain your old age, for he is born of your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. Naomi took the child and held it to her bosom. She became its foster mother. And the women neighbors gave him a name, saying, a son is born to Naomi. Also weird. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, father of David. And so we get this line. This is the line of Peretz. So Peretz begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Aminadab. Aminadab begot Nachshon. Nachshon, Salomon. Salmon begot Boaz. Boaz, Obed. Obed, Jesse. Jesse, and David. Who's David for them? Who is Ellis? You're muted. That's why I'm sorry.
Prophet.
So it's King David.
Yeah.
So what's real? So I will just give the context that there's this a weird thing, right? The rabbis are like, ooh, so Ruth is a convert, so we can't actually have King David, like the king, come from a convert. So we sort of have to be like, well, actually, it's like Naomi's son, right? Because Naomi's Jewish, right? So that makes it really easy. Interestingly, we actually don't. This is not really how this transaction usually works. Usually, when someone passes away and someone else has a baby, like the wife of that person marries that person's brother in order to carry on the name of her dead husband. So what's really weird is that we actually don't get the dead husband's name. We get Boaz's name. So that's also weird. But we get Obed, Jesse, David. In rabbinic thought, the Messiah comes from the house of David. Jesus is from the house of David, theoretically, right? So the Christians also believe this in a different way, right? They believe the Messiah had to come from the house of David. For them, Jesus comes from the house of David. Jews also believe the Messiah comes from the house of David. They just don't believe that it's Jesus. So this is something that comes up not only at Sukkot, it also comes up at Shavuot, right? We're talking about, once again, this particular moment, but we're also talking about the Messiah. We're talking about this messianic time where time actually doesn't exist, right? There's not a time for this and a time for that because the Messiah is here. There's no time anymore. But we've lost the concept of time when the Messiah comes. So oh, there's the Bereshit one. I will also point out that we actually rehearse this every week. We rehearse this Ruth piece every week because it's part of, does anybody know? Peretz is probably the best clue for most of us. It happens every Saturday night or every Friday night. when we sing Lecha Dodi, the line of Jesse Ben Yishai is part of Lecha Dodi. So the Messianic time, right? Shabbat being part of Messianic time, there's a time for Shabbat, and Shabbat is also a taste of the world to come, of the Messianic time. So we love to play with that. This last piece is from something called the Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is like a midrash collection of midrash homiletical stuff. It's sort of a weird book, but it also has one of my favorite sort of quotes. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai used to say, "If you have a sapling in your hand and they tell you the Messiah is coming, first plant the sapling and then go greet him." What is that? Does somebody want to put that into
Yeah, do what you have to. Don't wait for something else to be coming around.
100%? Yeah. The Messiah says they're here. Great. Well, the Messiah will still be there. Let me finish what I got to do, and then I'll go talk to the Messiah, supposedly.
Do list, the honey-do list comes first.
Yes. The honey-do list. I just learned that phrase like this year. I'd never heard it before. Love this. Yeah, right. It's such a weird idea, right? This holy moment, but you're like, yeah. Okay, well, I'm gonna wash my dishes and then we'll go see about this Messiah, right? We'll go figure that piece out. And some of that might just have to do with the time period, right? We have a long history. Um, if you're, I'll say this to a video screen. If you're a Christian watching this, this is not meant to sound uh like a critique, right? But there's a long history of people claiming to be the Messiah, and Jesus was by far the most successful at it, right? Which is why Christianity exists, because right, it wasn't even claimed by Jesus, right? It was claimed by Paul, or Peter. Peter? Yes, right. But this idea of Messiah, people claiming the Messiah, this could just be a critique of that, right? It could just be like, yeah, there's lots of people doing this right now. Do what you got to do, because false messiahs, dime a dozen. But I think that it like Ruth, like Sukkot, like the Ecclesiastes, like this Leviathan piece, I think that it points to sort of our discomfort with living in the moment and the fact that we can't get eternity out of our heads. We can't actually, we're so in touch with that myth that we have, right, a foot in the past and a foot in the future. um Somebody recently said, if you have a foot in the past and a foot in the future, then you're pissing on today, which I always really appreciated that. And I don't think that's necessarily what's happening here, but it does make it really, it makes it really difficult because there's everything in between, right? This is the unsatisfying thing about, there is a time, but we're looking for a time when we don't have to worry about it anymore, is that there's all this stuff in the middle. And that's the thing that we can't seem to figure out. Uh we can be in this moment of Sukkot, and we know that Sukkot's gonna come. We hope Sukkot's gonna come the next year. But there's a year in the middle of it that we're trying to figure out what we're supposed to do with ourselves. Um, I, yeah. And so I wanted to bring this to you today because as liberal Jews, I think it's really hard to, I said to somebody recently who's like very politically active that I think that they are less happy right now, but they're more optimistic about the future. Whereas I'm sometimes more okay with this moment, but I'm deeply concerned about what comes next. Um, and I never know, I never know what to do with that, that piece of it. I don't know if we have a good answer in liberal Judaism of how we connect this living in the moment with this unforeseeable future. I don't know. Or maybe I'm just a pessimist. I don't know.
Part of wanting change for the future is critique of the current in what you want to change to make that better future. So there's hope, but it's hope comes with that critique of the current. And if you're too content with where you are now, how do you shape the future if you're just letting it come?
Right, but one could also say that if you're constantly critiquing the moment, are you in it?
Mm,
That's a good one.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's true, but I mean, like that's the other side of that, right? Is like, um, what's his name? Yerushalmi. There's a historian no, Barone, who talked about the lachrymose interpretation of Jewish history, which is like everything in history has been against the Jews, right? Um, and he's like, yeah, like that is true. But there's also times when it's actually been really great for the Jews, right? Like, and they've really done okay for themselves. It's like when we say like we're living in a time when X, and then it's like, well, yeah, but statistically speaking, these things are actually lower than they've ever been before, right? So I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but I am saying that like they're both interpretations, right? They're both interpretations, and one or the other might take you out of this moment and put you in a future, or vice versa, that you didn't intend in the first place. Or we just wait for the Messiah. That seems like a valid one. We get our own fans, we go around, we hand out Shabbat candles to everybody. Right. I love that. Like I'm sometimes envious of that, right? Like I'm sometimes envious of that interpretation of like what we're doing in that moment is we're doing a tikkun, right? We're correcting the world so that the Messiah can come into it. And the way we do that is through mitzvot, right? Like it's actually a very satisfying um
It places you within the pattern of what's coming and to feel some connection to it and not just riding the wave of this is how life is unfolding. And yeah.
yeah. Well, if you believe that our tradition can answer anything, right, then right, like the difference between, and maybe this is maybe that piece of it, like the piece that I wanted to bring to y'all and was struggling with is if you live your life as closely to, I'm going to say halakha, right? Just as an example, right? But like if you live your life in accordance with a very strict interpretation, yeah, you're gonna fail, right? Like I mean, we're humans, we make mistakes all the time. Like we're gonna fail, right? But if you live your life in that way and you believe that that is what the future is, then you really do bring those things together in a way that I don't know, you know, that I don't know that everybody else can, right? Um, like if you're not dealing with the problem of how do we interpret the Leviathan, right? The Leviathan is the Leviathan. You really can live your life as though you're already in the moment of redemption, right? Like like you've made them the same thing, um, which is interesting. I'm not necessarily recommending it, but I do think it's an interesting. That's one way to solve the problem. One way to solve the problem of how we get from here to there is to make them the same thing.
That's interesting.
I'll take the messy, but very like personally.
Mm.
But have people encountered any of this by this way? I never tend to ask. I usually just present stuff. Have other people seen this Leviathan thing before? Has anybody ever said that blessing?
I have.
Or have you heard it before? Shocked. Love learning new stuff. So weird.
And it's as somebody who is very heartily Reconstructionist, I don't, it's how do other people look at this and go, okay, well, don't take that just like it is. Don't, that's not exactly, well, you got to frame it a little differently, you know. How do you not encounter some of these and go, well, that one's just there for that? Or I don't know. It's, again, you're saying that point in time where we shifted from the Bible being history to the Bible essentially becoming literature. Right? It was
Hmm.
a slow pivot, but and how that changes the way we look backward at everything, and then that starts to build the, like you said, history as a discipline, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very weird it's a weird thing because going, I'm going to keep coming back to the thing you said, Wilma, about like every 100 years, um, uh, the so the Bible, right? We have the Reformation. You have some people who cling, right? So this is B'nai Lappi, Rabbi B'nai Lappi, who from Sfara, right? Like has this crash theory. Not the only person to talk about it, but when we encounter a crash in the way we think about the world, we have a couple different options. One is we become even more conservative about it in like a very like little c, like literally conserving something, right? We cling more deeply to it. We say it's totally wrong and we leave it behind. Or we say, well, it sort of means that, right? Like, it's the Goldilocks phenomena, right? Um, and so the Bible becomes literary and history becomes history. But then we get deconstructionism and post-structuralism, which says, well, actually, all truth is sort of fake, right? We make up truth based on our interpretation. And so suddenly, even history becomes literary, right? Everything becomes individualized in particular kinds of ways. And so um, that that in and of itself is interesting. Um,
In
that
the
this,
moment, yeah, where we're at now with people looking back at history and finally seeing the tint of the author's viewpoint on things and going, hey, some of that's missing some stuff. And that's an interesting point where we're at with history now and people's opinions on.
well, and I mean, I think you're all quite aware. I'm not a medical person. We have medical people who can know this a lot better than I do, I'm sure. Right. But a great example that I think would be important to bring out there is when we talk about um things like caloric intake or how diabetes works or all right. Like when we talk about medical things, an assumed piece, like some of this stuff comes from much, much earlier, is that, well, actually, we never talked about the fact that many of the people that this is based on were white men, right? Um, which doesn't make it not true. It just makes it less true for everybody, right? It means it's more true for some people. Um, and so like that's a really interesting thing of like we're not actually saying it's not true. We're just saying it's not the full picture. Um, and so then history comes into question. Well, what history are we talking about? Like, whose history? How do we define what's history? Um, right? Like these are all important things. Like a Texas school district voted to reclassify a nonfiction book about native tribe as fiction.
Yeah, this is an article Joey shared with me this morning where basically an indigenous story from an indigenous perspective, they've just went, nah, that's fiction. They literally classified it as fiction.
Interesting.
Where that's that reaction you said before, that small key C conservative of somebody presents a new idea or a new way of looking at things and you just react, no, 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 towards your previous viewpoint and stick your feet in the ground and don't change.
Hmm.
And I've read articles about how there is differing brain structure in people that tend to have that reaction and the people that tend to accept new ideas, early adopters and people that are quicker to jump into a new way of thought, like the one end of the Overton window versus the other, pulling at what things mean. And yeah. No.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not an easy, it's all gray. It's all gray, unfortunately. Um,
There's time for togetherness, time for division, and
Ugh.
we can look at like how we've ended up in this cultural moment. And I don't know if there has been a time in my lifespan where we were less divided or undivided, I guess. That like there's I think back to maybe wartime eras, times of crisis in which peoples come together and things become more resolved in unifying ways. But now we've hit that time of not. So it's all in there. There's a time for this, a time for that, and it's all gonna keep coming, and it's all part of eternity, I guess it says.
But I think there's always going to be a time when we can find outliers.
Yes.
I mean, think about the ritual well, about outliers feeling uncomfortable about the sukkah that I shared with you, Liz.
Yeah.
I can grab it and
Before.
put it in the chat.
Sure.
But just the idea that, not everyone gets to feel totally accepted or even partially accepted sometimes. But like if we think about one of those things with Simchat Torah, we have so many people who weren't assigned male at birth into Orthodox communities don't get to go out and dance with the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it depends, that's why we have different, groups and, people who are not Orthodox and, more liberal.
Yeah, there was a time where Judaism was Judaism, but now we have these branches of just people who have conserved certain thoughts, people who are bringing in new ideas, and
Well, we are in the United States, and if you go to a lot of other countries, basically, if you look for something Jewish, they're all Orthodox in, a lot of countries.
part of that's got to be the cultural significance of the ability to be free about your religion in the US, where we can sit there and argue and divide up.
Well, I hope people are going to learn to talk to each other. That's all I have to say. That's, it's important that whatever you think or whatever you believe, that you at least don't hate the other. That's the most important thing to me. talk to your neighbor. They might not think the same as you, but be kind to, everybody.
I agree.
At any rate, I was falling asleep. I'm sorry. I think I'm going to take a nap.
That's fine. I'm pretty boring. I get it.
No, it has nothing to do with boring. It has to do with the fact that I just ate. I had gone to exercise and then I did my Yiddish class and then I came to you.
Oh
So,
my gosh, Wilma, that's a full day.
well, it can't be a full day. I have more things to do.
Well, fair enough. All right. No, but anyway, I think that this is all. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and or listening and just trying to
May
like.
I ask what the topic was supposed to be since I actually came in late? It's all interesting.
No, you were right on time. We waited like 15 minutes. It is there is a time or is there? So I was just interested in this idea of time and like the way, we talk about temporary or moment things versus how we're constantly connecting them to this like unknown future with a Messiah coming along. Yeah, I'm just fascinated by it because we don't have Messiah in the same way in Recon. Just like we don't have God in the same way in Recon, where, the power that makes for salvation in the universe, whatever that means.
Well, the one thing I really have always liked about Haskalah is that you'll be accepted regardless of how in your concept of God. And I think we all have different concepts of God. And I think that's just fine.
Absolutely. I think that we need to bring back the idea of priority, that there are things more important than ourselves. That taking care of other people can actually be more important than being correct, even if you know that you are. And the truly infuriating possibility that you can deeply hate someone and still take care of them. And I think that we need to cultivate that more. As weird as that sounds, I think we have to.
I don't think we should hate, though. I just don't think we should hate. See, that's
Well, just I mean,
disagree is one thing, but hate is another.
I think that there are people who genuinely, if they knew me, right, like genuinely, if they met me, would say hate, and I think that I would agree. I think it's all well and good to say strongly dislike, but I think that if we could really get to that point, that would actually be really impressive. So I'm going to say hate. I'm going to stick with hate because I actually think it could be possible. And if it were possible, that would be unbelievably cool. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, Wilma. I don't disagree with you. I think we should try to not hate people, no matter how annoying they are.
I think I only experience hate as a reciprocal reaction to somebody else's hate.
Ooh, interesting.
That's like I hate. That is kind of where I draw the line. Joey's very good point. How often is hatred a cover for another emotion? I'd say I hate cops, but really it's more deeper and expansive with I find cops triggering of my PTSD. At least I can say. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think that that's an important question. I'm not going to try to answer it because I think that it's a question that we can sit with. However, what I do want to bring up, it's something that when we talk about Tisha B'Av, right? At Tisha B'Av, we talk about the idea of sinat chinam, senseless hatred, is what caused the destruction of the temple. And my follow-up question to all that is, well, what's just sinat? Right? Like not senseless, right? That would to suggest senseless hatred would mean that there's some other kind of hatred that isn't senseless. And so I don't know what the rabbis mean by that. I would have to do more exploration of that. It'd probably be a pretty interesting topic. Yeah, I don't know. Right? Like maybe they would probably say like hating injustice, right? Or something like, something, hallmarky and beautifully idyllic like that. But I don't know. But I think you bring up a really good point, Wilma. And I think you also, Joey, to say like this question of like what is it
what am I using this word for to stand in for something that actually is something different? It's a great question. So I want to make sure Wilma can go take a nap because that sounds lovely.
I took
Goodbye,
very long,
Wilma.
but enough to get my brain screwed on so I can do something else.
Absolutely. Yeah, just refresh. Yeah, just refresh yourself. Okay, amazing. Shabbat, Shavua Tov, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.